Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today we're going to get into something pretty fascinating, I think. Aptitude tests.
Oh, yeah.
These tests that sort of try to see into the future a little bit,
Yeah.
see what your potential is. It's not just about what you know right now. It's about what you could know
Right.
with the right kind of development, the right skills. Think of it like a career crystal ball.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the source material today that we're diving deep on is a chapter from a book called Salkind, CA8.PDF, and it has some really interesting stuff on these tests.
What I find really fascinating is how aptitude tests aren't just measuring what you've already learned.
Right.
It's really more about your potential in certain areas.
So it's not like spitting back facts that you've memorized. It's more like
No.
figuring out what you're actually good at.
Yeah, exactly. It's trying to assess your inherent abilities. So like how you might apply them to new and challenging situations.
Okay.
So like the SAT and the ACT, a lot of people think of them as achievement tests.
Right. Which makes sense because they are covering a lot of what you've learned in high school.
Right.
Right. But they're also kind of being used to predict how well you'll do in college.
Exactly.
That's the future focus.
Yeah, that's looking ahead.
Yeah.
So it's a hybrid almost.
Yeah. They're a little bit of both. They're looking at what you've achieved,
Right.
but also what you're capable of achieving.
So they're looking back and forward at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, it makes sense. Are there tests that are purely about potential?
Yeah.
Just straight up aptitude?
Absolutely. There are. And one in particular that the book brings up
Okay.
is the GLAT,
Oh, yeah.
the Google Labs Aptitude Test.
I've heard of that one. That's the one with the weird questions.
Yeah, it's known for a very unusual style of question.
Yeah.
And Google uses it to assess thinking and reasoning skills,
Okay.
which they consider just absolutely essential for their employees.
Yeah. They give an example. You a series of random numbers, and you have to figure out the pattern to determine the next line.
So it's not even multiple choice.
It's not even multiple choice.
Oh, wow. That's really getting at how you think.
Yeah.
Not just whether you can remember formulas.
Exactly.
Right.
It really highlights the difference between an aptitude test and an achievement test.
Yeah.
One's about potential. The other one's about knowledge you've already acquired.
Yeah, so it's raw talent almost,
Yeah.
ability to learn and adapt versus, okay, what have you already achieved?
Yeah.
But how do they come up with these tests? Is there a secret formula?
There's definitely a method to it. Building an aptitude test is actually a pretty rigorous process. The book breaks it down into 4 key steps.
Okay, let's hear it. Step 1.
So the first is you have to define the skills that you're trying to measure.
Right.
You have to know exactly what you're looking for before you start even designing the test.
Makes sense.
So let's say you're creating a test for aspiring chefs.
Okay, I like this. Okay.
So the first step would be figuring out what specific skills separate the really great chefs from the ones who are just okay.
Right, so you've got to figure out what makes a great chef tick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
What's next?
So step 2 is where you create the task that actually assess those skills.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of just asking chefs multiple choice questions about different techniques,
Right.
you might have them actually do a hands-on test,
Right.
like peel an apple or something.
Right. That makes way more sense than just asking trivia questions. You actually see their skills in action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So step 3 is where they focus on identifying effective items.
Okay.
So they'll analyze the results and figure out which tasks really differentiate between the high-performing and low-performing chefs,
Right.
and then constantly refine the test to make sure that it's accurate.
So it's a lot of trial and error,
Yep.
tweaking it, making sure it's measuring what it's supposed to.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. Even commercial test publishers, like the ones who make the LSAT.
Right, the LSAT. I bet they've got some tricky questions.
They do. The book gives an example of an LSAT logical reasoning question.
Okay.
And it's a scenario about polar bear navigation.
Oh, wow.
And you have to pick the statement that casts the most doubt on a certain claim.
Okay.
And it's a great example of how these tests can measure critical thinking and information analysis.
Yeah, that's a tough one. But it's interesting. You can see how that, even if you don't know anything about polar bears,
Right.
how that could actually reveal a lot about your reasoning abilities.
Exactly. And that ongoing process of refining the tests is essential
Right.
to ensuring validity and reliability,
Okay.
which we'll get into later.
Yeah, we're going to get into that. This is all really interesting stuff. So we've covered kind of the purpose of these tests, how they're developed, but there's going to be a whole universe of different types of aptitude tests out there, right?
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
not just all about logic and reasoning.
Right.
There are tests for mechanical skills artistic talent, even your readiness for specific careers or education.
Okay, you've officially piqued my interest. Let's get into some of those different types of aptitude tests. Starting with, what do we got?
Let's start with a category that might surprise you: mechanical aptitude.
Okay.
These tests focus on a whole range of skills, psychomotor skills, from hands-on assembly to spatial reasoning challenges.
So, like, if I were building a model airplane from scratch
Yeah.
or fixing a leaky faucet,
I-
I'm not exactly known for my mechanical skills.
Yeah, exactly. And those are the kind of skills that some of these tests measure.
Right.
There's even specific tests designed for this,
Okay.
like the Bennett Mechanical Comprehension Test.
Okay.
You might also have heard of the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, or ASVAB.
Oh, yeah, the ASVAB.
Yeah,
That's the one they use for the military to assess recruits. Right.
exactly.
But it's not just about, like, fixing Jeeps in the field.
No, it covers a surprisingly wide range of aptitudes, including mechanical comprehension, electronics, and even like automotive knowledge.
Oh, wow. So there's more to it than I thought.
There is, yeah.
It's not just being handy with tools. It's really about understanding how things work.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the ASV's a great example of how they can be used not just for measuring skills,
Right.
but actually for helping people kind of figure out career paths.
Right. Identify areas where they might excel.
Okay, cool.
So we've got, like, the mechanically inclined folks covered.
Right.
What about the more artistic types?
Mm-hmm.
Is there, like, aptitude tests for creativity?
Absolutely. Artistic aptitude tests try to evaluate talents
Wow.
and things like music, drawing, and other forms of creative expression.
That's amazing. How do you even begin to measure something as subjective as artistic potential?
That's definitely a challenge. But there are tests that try to quantify artistic aptitude.
Okay.
For example, the primary and intermediate measures of music audition were actually designed to be used with young children.
Wait, hold on. They're giving aptitude tests to little kids.
They are, yeah.
Like asking a 5-year-old to conduct an orchestra or something?
Not quite. But they do use pictures instead of like words or numbers
Okay.
to try and reduce the influence of language on the results.
Uh,
So kids will listen to musical patterns and then have to identify whether those patterns are the same or different.
okay.
So it's a way to test their oral perception abilities.
Oh, so they're not seeing if they can play an instrument or not. They're seeing if they have, like, a natural ear for music.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
And these tests can actually help to identify children who might thrive in like a musical environment
Right.
or even have the potential for a musical career.
That's incredible. Wow. I'm starting to see how these tests can actually open up possibilities for people.
They definitely can.
Okay.
And speaking of opening doors, there's also something called readiness aptitude tests.
Readiness, like, are you ready for kindergarten?
That's the general idea. The book talks about Arnold Gesell, who was a pioneer in child development. He was a big advocate for using these tests to determine whether or not children were actually ready for school.
So, like, do they have the basic skills and the developmental milestones
Yeah.
to actually succeed in the classroom?
Exactly. He believed that, kids develop at their own pace,
Right.
and it's really important to meet them where they are developmentally.
Yeah.
So his research led to tests like the Gesell Child Development Age Scale, which is actually still used today
Wow.
to track children's developmental progress.
So it's not about, like, labeling kids as ahead or behind.
Right.
It's more about really understanding where they are and what they need.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while we may not call them readiness tests anymore, that same idea applies in other areas of education as well. Think about the GRE, for instance.
Oh, yeah, the GRE, that's for grad school.
Yeah,
So it's not a readiness test, but it's kind of making sure you have the foundation for graduate level work.
exactly. It's all about making sure that you're ready to succeed
Right.
in that next step of your education.
So we've got tests for mechanical skills, artistic talent, readiness for school or specific fields. Is there anything else?
There's one more category the book talks about,
Okay.
which is clerical aptitude tests.
Okay.
These tests focus on skills that are really important in a lot of like administrative and office-based jobs.
Okay. Clerical aptitude. I have to admit that doesn't sound quite as exciting as some of the other ones.
I know it doesn't,
Okay.
but don't underestimate those skills.
Okay.
Things like attention to detail, accuracy, and speed
Okay.
when you're working with like numbers and letters.
Okay, yeah, that is important. I wouldn't want someone who is constantly making typos,
Right.
handling my important document.
Exactly. And the book actually points to the Minnesota Clerical Test, or the MCT,
Okay.
as a classic example.
What makes that one so special?
It's known for being incredibly simple. but also very effective. It's basically just comparing pairs of names or numbers
Oh,
and saying whether they're the same or different.
oh, okay.
And this test has been shown to be a really accurate predictor of
Wow.
how well someone's going to do in a clerical role.
So even those seemingly mundane tasks can reveal a lot about someone's aptitude.
Exactly. That's the beauty of these tests.
Yeah.
They can uncover hidden talents and potential that you might not even know you have.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening exploration of all these different types of aptitude tests. We've covered so much ground, but I feel like there's still so much more to learn.
There is, and the book actually provides a really great resource
Okay.
for anyone who wants to dig deeper. Table 8.1.
Okay, table 8.1, what is that?
It's basically a cheat sheet.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It lists some of the most widely used aptitude tests,
Okay.
along with their purpose, target audience, key features.
Okay.
It's a really good starting point for anyone who's curious.
Cool. I'm going to check that out.
Yeah.
But before we get lost in all the specifics of individual tests, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier. Validity and reliability.
Ah, yes.
Like, what's the point of taking an aptitude test if it doesn't actually measure what it says it's going to measure?
Exactly.
And what if the results are just a fluke?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So the book stresses how vital strong predictive validity is, which means...
Basically, this means that scores on the test should actually correlate to how well you perform in the real world.
Right. So, like, if an aptitude test is supposed to predict how well you'll do in college, then students who score high on that test should, on average, have better grades than those who score lower.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So it's proving that it's actually, like, a reliable indicator of the future outcome?
Yeah. And then there's retest reliability.
Okay.
Which basically means that if the same person takes the test multiple times, they should get pretty similar scores, assuming their abilities haven't changed significantly.
Right. You don't want a test that's going to give you completely different results depending on your mood that day.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like those two things are like the cornerstones of any good aptitude test.
Absolutely. Without those two qualities, the results are essentially meaningless.
So how do test developers make sure that their tests are valid and reliable? Is there a secret formula?
It's not a simple process.
Okay.
It involves a lot of rigorous statistical analysis and research.
Okay.
They have to gather tons of data on how those scores correlate with real-world outcomes.
Okay.
And how consistent those scores are over time. And they're constantly updating those tests as new data becomes available.
It sounds like a lot of work goes into this.
It really does.
But it's worth it, because when they're done right,
Yeah.
these tests can be incredibly valuable tools.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For self-discovery, career planning, educational guidance. Yeah. I'm totally with you on that. This whole conversation has made me think about aptitude tests in a totally different way. You know, I used to think they were just about measuring intelligence or predicting academic success.
Yeah.
Now I'm seeing how they can be so much more than that.
They really can be.
Yeah.
At their core, they're about unlocking human potential.
Yeah.
And helping people to understand their own strengths.
Right.
They're about exploring all the different possibilities that are out there.
I'm definitely going to check out that table 8.1.
Yeah.
Learn more about some of these specific tests you mentioned.
Yeah.
But before we do,
Yeah.
there's one last question from the book that I think is pretty thought-provoking.
Okay.
It asks, what have your experiences been like with aptitude tests?
Well, that's a good question.
You know, because we've been talking about it sort of theoretically.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember there are real people behind every test score.
Right.
So have they opened doors to unexpected opportunities for you? Have they confirmed what you already knew about your strengths? Or maybe even left you feeling uncertain, limited? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think your insights can really add to this whole conversation.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive,
Okay.
I want to encourage you to reflect on your own experiences and share your thoughts with us.
Yeah. And remember, whether you're a fan of aptitude tests or maybe you're skeptical, there's no denying that these assessments can offer valuable insights into our strengths and potential.
Absolutely.
Right. It's up to each of us to use that information wisely.
Right.
And remember that we're all more than just a score on a test.
Absolutely. So where were we? Oh, yeah, different types of aptitude tests.
Yeah, we were about to dive into some specific categories.
Right.
What else is out there besides the mechanical ones?
Well, there are artistic aptitude tests. They try to evaluate talents in music, drawing, things like that.
Okay.
Other creative expression.
That's really interesting, but how do you measure something like artistic potential? I mean, it's not like you can put creativity on a scale.
It is tough. It's a challenge, for sure. But there are tests that try to quantify artistic aptitude. For instance, the primary and intermediate measures of music audition
Right.
were designed for, get this, young children.
Hold on, they're giving aptitude tests to little kids.
Yeah.
Are they like asking a 5-year-old to conduct an orchestra?
Not quite, but they do use pictures instead of words or numbers,
Oh, okay.
to reduce the influence of language on the results. So kids will listen to musical patterns, and then they have to identify if those patterns are the same or different.
Okay.
It's testing their oral perception abilities.
So they're not seeing if they can play an instrument, they're seeing if they have like an ear for music?
Exactly.
Got it.
And these tests can actually help identify children who might, really thrive in a musical environment.
Yeah?
Maybe even have a musical career.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm starting to see how these tests can really open doors for people.
For sure.
Give them possibilities they maybe wouldn't have even considered. Okay, so what else you got?
Let's talk about readiness aptitude tests.
Readiness, like making sure you're ready for kindergarten or something.
Yeah, you got it. The book mentions Arnold Gesell. He was like a pioneer in child development
Okay.
and a big advocate for readiness tests to see if kids were really ready for school.
So like making sure they have the skills and development
Yeah.
to actually succeed in a classroom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He believed that kids develop at their own pace.
Yeah.
And it's super important to meet them where they are developmentally.
Right.
His research actually led to tests like the Gesell Child Development Age Scale, which is still used today
Wow.
to track a child's developmental progress.
So it's not about labeling kids as ahead or behind.
Yeah.
It's about figuring out where they are and what they need.
Exactly. And even though we might not call them readiness tests anymore, that same idea is still relevant, like the GRE, for example.
Oh, the GRE for grad school.
Yeah, exactly. It's not specifically labeled as a readiness test or anything, but
Oh.
it is assessing whether a student has what they need for grad school.
Right, making sure you've got the foundation.
Exactly, making
Mhm.
sure you're prepared for that next level.
Okay, so we've got mechanical, artistic, readiness. Anything else? What other kinds of aptitudes are there?
Well, the book also highlights clerical aptitude tests. These tests focus on skills that are really important in a lot of administrative jobs, office jobs.
Clerical aptitude. Honestly, that doesn't sound quite as exciting as some of these other categories we've been talking about.
I know, but don't underestimate these skills.
Okay.
Think about attention to detail, accuracy, speed,
Okay.
when you're working with numbers and letters and things like that.
Yeah, those are important. I certainly wouldn't want someone who is constantly making typos, handling my important documents.
Exactly. And the book gives an example. The Minnesota Clerical Test, or the MCT, is a really good example.
What's so special about that one?
It's incredibly simple, but really effective. It's basically just comparing pairs of names or numbers
Okay.
and saying whether they're the same or different.
Oh, okay.
And this test has been a really accurate predictor of how well someone's going to do in a clerical role.
So even seemingly mundane tasks can reveal a lot about somebody's aptitude.
Exactly. That's what's so cool about these tests. They can uncover those hidden talents and potential that you might not even know you have.
Wow, this whole conversation has been so eye-opening.
Yeah.
I used to think aptitude tests were all about like intelligence or something.
Right.
Or predicting academic success.
Mm.
Now I'm seeing how they can be so much more.
Me too. And you know what? The book actually provides a really great resource if you want to dig a little deeper.
Okay, tell me more.
It's Table 8.1,
Okay.
and it's basically a cheat sheet. It lists some of the most widely used aptitude tests, along with their purpose, target audience, key features, all that good stuff.
Okay.
It's a really good starting point if you're curious to learn more.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check that out. But before we do, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, validity and reliability.
Oh yeah, that's important.
Because what's the point of taking a test if it doesn't actually measure what it claims to measure?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
What if the results are just a fluke?
Right.
So the book really stresses strong predictive validity,
Mm-hmm.
which basically means the scores should correlate to how someone performs in the real world.
Exactly. So for instance, if the aptitude test is supposed to predict how well you do in college,
Right.
then students who score high on that test should, on average, have better grades than those who score lower.
Right. It's like proving that the test is actually a reliable indicator.
Right. And then there's also retest reliability,
Okay.
which essentially means if the same person takes the test multiple times, they
Yeah.
should get similar scores.
Right. You wouldn't want a test that gives you completely different results,
Exactly.
depending on what kind of mood you're in that day.
No, not at all.
So it sounds like validity and reliability are pretty crucial to any good aptitude test.
They are the cornerstones.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Without those two qualities, the results are basically meaningless.
Okay. So how do test developers actually make sure their tests are valid and reliable? Is there some sort of secret formula?
It's a process for sure. It's not a simple one.
Okay.
It involves a lot of rigorous statistical analysis and ongoing research.
Okay.
They have to gather a ton of data, to see how those scores actually correlate with those real-world outcomes
Right.
and how consistent those scores are over time. And then they're constantly updating and refining the tests as new data becomes available.
So it sounds like a lot of work goes into this,
It does.
but it's worth it because when it's done right, these tests can be really incredible tools
Yeah, they can.
for self-discovery, career planning, educational guidance.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
This whole conversation has really made me rethink aptitude tests.
Mm-hmm.
I used to think they were all about, like I said, intelligence or something, predicting academic success. But now I'm seeing how they can be so much more than that.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
They really can be. At their core, they're all about unlocking human potential
Yeah.
and, helping people really understand their strengths.
Right, exactly.
They're about exploring all the different possibilities that are out there.
I am definitely going to be checking out Table 8.1.
Yeah, I think you'll find it interesting.
Learn more about these different tests, but before we jump into that,
Yeah.
there's one last question from the book that I think is really interesting and thought-provoking.
Okay.
It asks, what have your experiences been with aptitude tests?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah. Because, we've been talking about this very theoretically, but we have to remember there are real people
Right.
behind every test score.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Have they opened doors to opportunities you maybe wouldn't have expected?
Mm-hmm.
Have they confirmed what you already knew about yourself, your strengths?
Yeah.
Or maybe left you feeling kind of uncertain or even limited?
Right.
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think those personal insights could add a lot to this conversation.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I want to encourage you to reflect on your own experiences with these tests and share your thoughts.
And remember, whether you love them or you're a little skeptical of them, there's no denying that these assessments can offer valuable insights into our strengths and our potential.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to use that information wisely.
Right.
And to remember, we're all more than just a score.
More than a score. For sure.
It's easy to forget that there's an actual person behind every single test score.
That's true.
And it kind of makes you wonder, what if these aptitude tests could do more than just predict what we're capable of? What if they could help us figure out, what we're meant to do?
Right.
Yeah,
that's a great question. Imagine if they could actually guide people toward careers that align with their natural talents, their passions.
Yeah, instead of just saying, hey, you're good at math, you should be an accountant.
Right.
It's like you've got this unique blend of analytical and creative skills. Have you ever thought about being a game designer?
Exactly. It'd be like using these tests as a compass, pointing you towards your true north,
Yeah.
not just sorting you into some predetermined category.
Yeah, it could be life-changing for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Think about all the people out there who are stuck in jobs they hate.
Right.
Maybe they just never had the chance to explore their potential.
Yeah, it makes you wonder.
It really does. It really highlights how important it is to have good aptitude testing and career counseling available.
For sure.
Especially for young people
Yeah, especially for young people.
who are just starting to think about their futures.
Absolutely.
And maybe as these tests get even more sophisticated,
Mm-hmm.
more personalized,
Yeah.
they can actually play a bigger role in helping people find their hidden talents
Right.
and pursue those dream careers, the ones that really light them up.
Absolutely. Just think, we could live in a world where everybody gets to do work they love.
That's a world I want to live in, for sure.
Right.
But I also wonder, as these tests get more powerful, more data-driven,
Yeah.
how do we make sure that they're used ethically, responsibly?
Yeah, that's a great point. We have to be really careful about biases and making sure that everyone has a fair shot.
Right. We don't want to create a system where people's opportunities are limited by some algorithm or some data that might be flawed or incomplete.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
It's all about using these tools for good,
Yeah.
helping individuals reach their full potential.
Exactly.
Well, this whole deep dive has been amazing.
It has been, hasn't it?
We've gone from the history and purpose of these tests all the way to, the future of this whole field.
Yeah, I know. It's really fascinating stuff.
And honestly, I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
It's a testament to how complex human potential really is.
It is.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, I want to encourage everybody listening, keep that sense of curiosity alive.
Mm-hmm.
Keep exploring your potential.
Yeah.
Check out Table 8.1 from the book. Maybe even try out a few tests that sound interesting.
I think you'll find it really fascinating.
And remember, you are so much more than just a score on a test.
Absolutely. Don't let anybody define you.
That's right.
You are capable of amazing things. This is just the beginning of your journey.
That's a great way to put it. The world needs your unique talents, your unique perspective.
It does.
So go out there and make your mark.
Absolutely.
This has been The Deep Dive.
Until next time.
Signing off.